Okay, so we're diving deep today into what it's really like trying to find a job in Norway as a foreigner.
Yeah,
And we've got a really interesting mix of sources this time around.
right.
We've got some on-the-ground perspectives from blogs like A Frog in the Fjord and Life in Norway.
Hmm.
We've also got this really fascinating Reddit discussion that you sent over. And then to kind of round things out, we've got a more statistical overview from Y-axis.
Yeah, that's a great set of sources. I
Yeah,
think it's really going to give us some good insights.
totally. And what we really want to do is cut through all the noise, right?
Yeah.
Forget those glossy brochures and those like top 10
Yeah,
lists.
absolutely.
We really want to give our listener the unvarnished truth.
Yeah, the nitty gritty.
Yeah, about what it's like to actually go through the process of finding a job in Norway as someone from outside the country.
It's not always easy.
Right. And so I think, at first glance, Norway seems like this kind of dream destination, right?
Hmm.
Especially when you look at it from the outside. I was looking at some stats and, back in 2019, they had an unemployment rate of like 3.8%, which is incredibly low.
That's a super low. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's this really important caveat that we have to remember,
Hmm.
and that is that the unemployment rate for foreigners was significantly higher,
Yeah, much higher.
closer to 5.5%.
Yeah.
So already we're seeing this kind of discrepancy.
Right away.
Yeah, yeah. And then on top of that, they have really attractive average salaries. You see finance roles often leading the way at like 6,000 euros pre-tax per month, which is a lot of money.
Oh, yeah. Very competitive salaries.
And then, they have this reputation for being a really happy society with a really strong emphasis on gender equality.
Absolutely a very progressive country.
Yeah, so it kind of paints this really rosy picture.
Yeah, it does. It seems like the perfect place.
But when you start digging into these sources,
Yeah.
particularly these firsthand accounts, it becomes clear that the reality on the ground is a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, it's definitely more nuanced than that.
Yeah, so let's start unpacking this. And I think a good place to begin is with A Frog in the Fjord and some of the key obstacles that they outlined.
Okay, sounds good.
And the very first one they mentioned, which I found really surprising, was the impact of your name,
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
and specifically having a foreign-sounding name.
Right. And they even cited a 2012 study.
Oh, wow. So this is like documented.
Yeah, it's not just anecdotal.
Okay.
This study showed that applicants with foreign-sounding names were 25% less likely to be called for an interview, even when they had the same qualifications as other applicants.
So like right off the bat,
Yeah, from the get-go.
you're facing this potential disadvantage.
Just because of your name.
It's wild. And even more concerning is that there have been reports in Norwegian media about people actually changing their names just to increase their chances of getting an interview.
Wow, so they're literally trying to assimilate just to get their foot in the door.
Exactly. And that really speaks volumes about how important it is to fit in and how much emphasis is placed on that.
Yeah, it's a lot of pressure.
So, okay, moving on to the second obstacle they highlighted, which is the need for Norwegian language proficiency.
Of course.
And I think this is something that a lot of people might assume isn't a huge deal because, English is very widely spoken in Norway.
Right? You'd think that would be enough.
But it seems like it's not always the case.
Yeah, not necessarily.
So how important is it really to learn Norwegian if you want to work there?
Well, it depends on the sector, for sure.
Right.
Like if you're working in tourism or maybe at an international tech company, English might be enough to get by.
Okay.
But increasingly, employers are looking for candidates who can also communicate in Norwegian, even if the main language of the job is English.
So it's kind of like English gets you in the door, but Norwegian is how you really move up.
Exactly. And it's also about fitting in with your colleagues and being able to participate fully in the workplace culture.
Right. It's not just about being able to do the job. It's about being able to integrate into the team.
Absolutely. And the blog suggested that a B1 level is often seen as a good starting point.
Which means you can handle everyday conversations and understand the main points of like clear standard input.
Right. Like if someone's giving you instructions or you're having a meeting, you should be able to follow along.
Okay, so that makes sense. And then the third obstacle that A Frog in the Fjord brought up was the impact of studies from non-Norwegian universities.
Interesting.
So basically, where you got your degree can actually matter quite a bit.
It seems that way.
Yeah, and they were saying that Norwegian employers tend to prefer candidates who graduated from well-known Norwegian institutions like BI.
Oh, So there's a preference for the local education system.
Yeah, and unless you're talking about like the top tier global universities like MIT or Harvard or
You see
Oxford,
the really prestigious ones.
the reputation of your foreign university might not carry as much weight as you might think,
It's almost like they have a built-in trust for their own system.
which makes sense in a way, right?
Yeah, they're familiar with it. They know the standards.
But it can be a bit of a hurdle for people coming in from outside. And they also made the point that for lower skilled jobs, Norwegian language skills might not be a strict requirement, but those roles often come with lower pay and less job security.
Right, so it's a bit of a trade-off.
Exactly. And then the fourth obstacle they talked about was the challenge of lacking a network in Norway.
Yeah, that's a tough one, especially for newcomers.
Because Norway is a relatively small country, right?
Yeah, comparatively.
So personal and professional networks tend to be very tight-knit and
Mhm.
often established over many years.
No, people have known each other since school or university.
And for foreigners who are new to the country, they just haven't had the time to build those connections.
And that can be a real disadvantage because a lot of job opportunities in Norway are never even advertised publicly.
So it's all about who you know.
Yeah, it's that hidden job market.
And the blog suggested attending industry conferences and seeking out career advice from professionals in your field as ways to start building that network.
That's good advice.
Yeah, it's about putting yourself out there and making those connections. All right, so the fifth obstacle they mentioned was the lack of understanding of Norwegian cultural cues, specifically in the context of job interviews.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other layer.
It's like you have to learn a whole new set of rules.
Unwritten rules.
Exactly. And they gave the example of being asked why you're leaving your previous job.
Mm-hmm.
And in Norway, it's not really acceptable to be negative.
Even if you had a terrible boss.
Right. You have to be very diplomatic.
And even being overly enthusiastic can be seen as a bad thing.
So there's this kind of like understated confidence that you need to project.
Yeah, it's a fine line.
And they said that cultural fit is often a really important factor in the hiring process.
Which makes sense. They want someone who's going to mesh well with the team.
Right. But it can be hard to figure out what that means exactly when you're coming from a different culture.
Absolutely. It's a lot to navigate.
Okay, so moving on to the sixth hurdle, the lack of Norwegian professional experience and references.
Yeah, this is a classic catch-22.
Because employers want to see that you've already worked in Norway, but how do you get that experience if you can't get a job in the first place?
Right, it's a chicken and egg situation.
And they suggested volunteering as a way to bridge that gap.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, as a way to gain some local experience and potentially even get some references.
And it shows that you're serious about living and working in Norway.
Exactly. And then the final obstacle they mentioned was that not all jobs are publicly advertised.
Ah, the hidden job market again.
Yeah, so while public sector jobs are usually advertised openly, private sector jobs are often filled through those existing networks that we talked about earlier.
So it's all about being connected and knowing the right people.
Right, and so now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the personal account shared by John Ward in Life in Norway.
Oh, yeah, his story was really eye-opening.
Yeah, he's this British guy with a business degree, financial services qualifications, and tons of experience at big companies in London.
He seems very qualified.
Yeah, and he even had a B1, B2 level of Norwegian.
So he was definitely putting in the effort.
But despite all of that, he spent 3 years and sent out over 1,000 applications without finding a job.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it really highlights the challenges that even highly qualified foreigners can face.
It's discouraging to hear.
And one of the things that John talked about was this perception that you need near-native fluency in Norwegian to really make a difference in your job prospects, especially for those white-collar roles.
So even B1, B2 wasn't enough.
It seems like it wasn't enough for a lot of the jobs he was applying for.
That's tough.
Yeah, and he mentioned that many job postings specifically stated that they require fluency in both English and Norwegian.
It's like they want you to be perfect in both languages.
Yeah, and he also talked about how the recruitment processes were often really long and drawn out.
Oh, man, that's the worst.
You go through multiple rounds of interviews, and then you wait months for a decision.
And sometimes you don't even get a decision. You just hear nothing.
It's so frustrating.
It's emotionally draining.
And he said that there were just far fewer job openings in Norway compared to a place like the UK.
That makes sense. Smaller country, smaller economy.
Yeah, so it's even more competitive.
And he also pointed out this frustrating thing where the same job postings would reappear over and over again,
Oh yeah, I've seen that too.
even after he'd already applied and been rejected.
It makes you wonder if they're even really looking to fill the position.
Or if they have extremely specific requirements that they're struggling to find.
Right, and then he also talked about the bureaucratic hurdles he faced as a non-EU citizen, specifically with getting a bank ID.
Oh, yeah. That's essential for so many things in Norway.
Yeah, it's like a digital ID that you need for online banking and even registering as a job seeker with NAV.
And after Brexit, it became even harder for British citizens to get one.
Yeah, he said it was a really complicated process and there was a long waiting period.
Just another barrier on top of everything else.
And then he also echoed that point about the importance of university networks.
Right, how some companies seem to really favor graduates from specific Norwegian institutions.
And he even mentioned that Oslo felt surprisingly lacking in diversity compared to other major European cities.
Interesting.
Yeah, he attributed that partly to Norwegian labor laws, the high salary costs, and maybe fewer incentives for big international companies to set up shop there.
So it's a more domestically focused job market.
Yeah, and he also pointed out that those generous working benefits that Norway is known for might not be universal.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he said that part-time contracts are quite common, especially in blue-collar industries.
And the taxes can be higher if you have multiple part-time jobs.
So it's not quite the utopia that people might imagine.
It's good to have a realistic view.
Yeah. And I think one of the most striking things that John said was that unless you have a really compelling reason to move to Norway, like family ties, people who have stable jobs and good careers in their home country might actually be better off staying put.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
Yeah. Yeah. And he said he was often told he was overqualified for roles even when he was doing gig economy work just to survive.
So he was stuck in this professional limbo.
Yeah, it's really disheartening. And his advice to other foreigners was to consider moving on to other countries if things don't work out in Norway.
That's some tough love.
Yeah. But it's also realistic.
Definitely.
So let's move on to the Reddit discussion, which had some really interesting perspectives from other people going through this process.
Yeah, I found that really helpful.
And one of the posts was from this American who had a master's degree in analytical chemistry and programming. And he also spoke Norwegian at like an A2B1 level.
Okay.
But he'd been applying for jobs for 6 months without any luck.
So similar to John's experience.
Yeah. And the other people in the thread were giving him all sorts of advice.
Makes sense, it's a support group.
Yeah, and one of the things they said was that he shouldn't be sending out hundreds of generic applications.
Oh yeah, quality over quantity.
Exactly. They told him to really tailor each application and write a compelling cover letter.
And preferably in Norwegian, if the job ad is in Norwegian.
Yeah, it's all about showing that you've put in the effort.
And that you're serious about the job.
And they also said it's important to highlight any existing Norwegian identifiers that you have.
Like a person number or a Norwegian bank account.
Yeah, those little things can make a difference.
It shows that you're already integrated into the system.
And then they really emphasize the importance of having a higher level of Norwegian language proficiency.
Like B2 or C1.
Yeah, they said that A2B1 just isn't going to cut it for most skilled positions.
It's a high bar.
And they also talked about the challenges of proving your language skills from abroad.
Right. How do you convince them that you're actually fluent?
It's tough. And then they also mentioned the disadvantage of being an overseas applicant who needs visa sponsorship.
Compared to local or EU candidates?
Yeah, because it adds another layer of complexity and cost for the employer.
It's a factor for sure.
And of course, the issue of name-based discrimination came up again.
Unfortunately.
Some people shared their own experiences of changing their names to try and get more responses.
It's sad that it comes to that.
It is. And then someone suggested looking into government jobs on the website jobnorge.no
Oh, interesting.
because they said that nationality and even perfect Norwegian might be less important for those roles.
Especially in fields like academia.
Yeah. And they also mentioned international nonprofit organizations as a potential option.
Because they might have more relaxed language requirements.
Right. And the importance of networking came up again as well.
Of course, it's all about who you know.
But there were also differing opinions about how prevalent discrimination actually is.
Yeah, some people thought it was less of an issue in highly educated fields.
While others felt like it was still a major barrier no matter what.
It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah, it probably depends on the industry and the specific company.
Definitely.
And then there were just a lot of personal stories from people who were struggling to find jobs despite having the right qualifications and even speaking Norwegian.
It can be a really tough market.
Yeah, it's clear that it's not easy.
So I guess the takeaway is that you have to be persistent and resilient.
And also strategic.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the last source we want to look at is the Norway Job Market 2025 Outlook from Y-Axis.
Okay, this should give us a more macro perspective.
Exactly, and they are predicting a really healthy employment rate of 66.28%.
Yes, good news.
Yeah, and a very low unemployment rate of 3.8%.
So the overall outlook is positive.
And they talked about Norway's work culture, which they described as being very employee-focused,
Yeah, they have a reputation for that.
with flat hierarchies, flexible working arrangements, and an emphasis on critical thinking and accountability.
That sounds like a great place to work.
Yeah, it does. And they also highlighted some specific sectors that are facing worker shortages.
Like what?
Well, the technology sector is a big one.
Oh, yeah, that's in demand everywhere.
They said there's a high demand for cloud architects, data scientists, and especially software engineers.
So if you have those skills, you're in luck.
And they also listed other in-demand occupations like engineering, accounting, and finance, human resource management, hospitality sales, and marketing healthcare, STEM fields, teaching and nursing.
That's a pretty wide range.
Yeah, so there are definitely opportunities out there.
But the report also stressed the importance of staying up to date with the job market.
Right, because it's constantly changing.
And they said that employers are increasingly looking for skills and practical experience over just degrees.
Yeah, so it's not enough to just have a piece of paper.
You need to be able to show what you can do.
And they emphasize soft skills like communication, teamwork, and problem solving.
Those are always valuable.
And they also talked about the rise of remote work.
Which can be great for flexibility.
But they also reiterated the importance of learning Norwegian.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme.
It's really the key to unlocking more opportunities.
And they gave some advice on the application process.
Yeah, like keep your CV concise, write a tailored cover letter, ideally in Norwegian, and be on time for your interviews.
Good.
And they suggested using online job platforms like fin.no and registering with recruitment agencies.
Makes sense.
And they also said that startup companies might be more open to English speakers.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so if you're not fluent in Norwegian, that could be a good option.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
And it's clear that finding a job in Norway as a foreigner can be a real challenge.
Yeah, but it's not impossible.
Definitely not.
So for our listener, what are the key takeaways here? What do you need to know if you're thinking about working in Norway?
Well, first of all, you need to be realistic about the challenges.
Right.
You need to be prepared to put in the work, to learn Norwegian, to build your network, and to adapt to the culture.
And don't get discouraged if you face rejections.
It's part of the process,
And remember that certain sectors are more in demand than others.
like technology.
So if you have skills in those areas, you might have an easier time.
And don't be afraid to explore alternative paths, like government jobs or international organizations.
Exactly. There are multiple ways to achieve your goals.
And here's a thought for you to consider as you navigate this journey. How much weight should you really put on formal qualifications and language skills versus developing a deep understanding of Norwegian culture and building a strong local network?
That's a great question.
Because sometimes those less tangible things might actually be more important in the long run.
Yeah, it's all about knowing how to play the game.
And that takes more than just a good CV.
Absolutely.
Great.
So do your research, be strategic, and be persistent.
And good luck.
Good luck.
You'll need it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
hey, you never know. You might just find your dream job in Norway.
That's true. It's a beautiful country with a lot to offer.
It is. So keep your chin up and keep trying.
That's the spirit.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, it was great talking to you.
Yeah, this was fun.
All right. And to our listener, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
See you next time.
Until next time.